Football isn't just a game. It's a theater of dreams and nightmares, of joy and heartbreak, of stories that make us cry, cheer, and believe in miracles. Over the years, the beautiful game has given us moments so emotional that they transcend sport and live forever in our hearts. Today, we relive the most emotional moments in football history, moments of triumph, tragedy, and unity that show why football is more than just 90 minutes on the pitch. In January 2019, the world of football was shaken by the heartbreaking story of Emiliano Sala. The Argentine striker had just signed a dream move to Premier League club Cardiff City, leaving behind Nantes with hopes of making his mark in English football. But on his flight across the English Channel, tragedy struck. His plane went missing, and after days of desperate search, Sala's body was eventually found in the wreckage. He never got to play a single match for his new club. The footballing world united in grief. Fans from Cardiff, Nantes, and across the globe paid tribute to a man whose career was cut short before it could truly begin. Sala's story remains one of the saddest chapters in football history, a reminder of how fragile life truly is. Portuguese striker Jota was a rising star, beloved for his energy and potential. His sudden death in a car accident shocked not only his teammates but fans worldwide who saw in him a future hero. At his funeral, fans held scarves, jerseys, and banners high, crying as they sang his name one last time. On the pitch, his teammates played matches in his memory, pointing to the sky after goals as a tribute. The tragedy left an empty space, not just in his club, but in football itself. His death reminded us that sometimes the biggest losses happen off the pitch in the cruelest of ways. In 2023, Ghanaian winger Christian Atsu, known for his humility and smile, was among the thousands who lost their lives in the devastating earthquake in Turkey. Atsu had just scored a last-minute goal days earlier, a moment of pure joy that would tragically be his final one. The football world was in tears as his body was found beneath the rubble. From Ghana to Newcastle, tributes poured in for a man, remembered not just for his skills, but his kindness and charity work. Atsu's passing was more than a loss for football. It was a global heartbreak, proof that heroes aren't only made on the pitch, but also in the way they live their lives. June 12, 2021. Denmark faced Finland in the Euro 2020 group stage, when suddenly Christian Eriksen collapsed to the ground. The world watched in horror as his teammates surrounded him, forming a protective circle while medics rushed in. For long minutes, it felt like football didn't matter anymore. Fans cried, commentators struggled for words, and even rival fans held up banners in support. Miraculously, Eriksen was revived and eventually recovered, later making a return to football. His story became one of survival, resilience, and the power of unity, proof that sometimes football's greatest victory is simply life itself. On February 6, 1958, Manchester United's young, talented Busby Babes team was flying back from a European Cup match when their plane crashed in Munich. 23 people lost their lives, including 8 United players. The tragedy devastated English football and nearly ended Manchester United as a club. But out of the ashes, the team rebuilt. Survivors like Sir Bobby Charlton carried the spirit of those lost, and a decade later, United lifted the European Cup in their honour. The Munich disaster remains one of the most emotional and defining moments in football history, a story of grief, resilience, and eventual triumph. Andres Iniesta's World Cup winning goal, 2010, July 11th, 2010, the World Cup final in Johannesburg. Spain versus the Netherlands. For 116 long minutes, the game was tense, physical, and filled with missed chances. Then, in extra time, Andrés Iniesta received the ball, controlled it with one touch and smashed it into the net. As the stadium erupted, Iniesta tore off his shirt to reveal a message. Dani Xarque siempre con nosotros. Dani Xarque, always with us. Xarque, his close friend and fellow Spanish footballer, had tragically died of a heart attack the year before. That goal was not just a winner, it was a tribute, a cry of love, and a nation's greatest sporting triumph. Millions of Spaniards wept that night, not only because their country had won its first ever World Cup, but because the moment carried the weight of personal grief and national pride. Berlin, 2006. The stage was set for a fairy tale ending. Zinedine Zidane, the French maestro, was playing his final professional match, the World Cup final against Italy. He had already scored a stunning penalty with a delicate panenka chip, showing his genius once again. But in extra time, the unthinkable happened. After an exchange of words with Marco Materazzi, Zidane turned and delivered a shocking headbutt to his opponent's chest. The referee showed the red card, and the football world gasped. France would go on to lose on penalties. For millions of fans, it was a heartbreaking moment, Zidane's glittering career ending not in glory, but in disgrace. Yet, even in that fall from grace, there was raw emotion, reminding us that football's greatest icons are also human. No words can truly capture the heartbreak of Brazil's 2014 World Cup semi-final. In Belo Horizonte, the host nation faced Germany with the hope of bringing joy to a country obsessed with football, but within 29 minutes, Germany scored 5 goals. By the end, it was 7-1. The stadium was in tears. Grown men sobbed into their flags, children cried in disbelief, and the entire nation felt humiliated. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a national trauma. To this day, the Minerazo is remembered as one of the most painful nights in football history. Yet it also showed the other side of the beautiful game, the cruelty, the heartbreak, and the way football can mirror the emotions of an entire nation. Cristiano Ronaldo dreamed of lifting a trophy with Portugal. In the Euro 2016 final against France, that dream seemed shattered when he was forced off in the first half due to injury, tears streaming down his face. But instead of disappearing, Ronaldo became Portugal's loudest voice on the sidelines, urging, shouting, and almost coaching alongside manager Fernando Santos. When Eder scored the winning goal in extra time, Ronaldo fell to his knees, crying tears of joy this time. Portugal, against all odds, had become champions of Europe. For Ronaldo, it was the perfect example of sacrifice, leadership, and emotion. The night he proved he was more than just a player, he was a symbol for his nation. For over a decade, Lionel Messi was haunted by the one trophy that always eluded him, the World Cup. 3 final defeats with Argentina left him on the verge of quitting international football. But in Qatar 2022, the stars finally aligned. In a final for the ages against France, Messi scored twice, led his team through penalties, and finally, at age 35, lifted the golden trophy. The image of Messi, smiling through tears, holding the World Cup high above his head as his teammates carried him on their shoulders, became instantly iconic. For millions of fans, it was more than just football. It was the completion of a destiny, the crowning moment of one of the greatest players in history. That night, football cried with joy. On November 25, 2020, the football world lost one of its greatest icons, Diego Armando Maradona. The Argentine legend, loved and hated in equal measure, had lived a life as dramatic as his football. From the E.T. hand of God to the goal of the century, Maradona gave football moments that would never be forgotten. But when news of his death spread, It wasn't about controversies or rivalries anymore. It was about love. In Argentina, millions poured into the streets to say goodbye. In Naples, where he had lifted Napoli to glory, fans lit candles, cried, and filled the city with chants of his name. Across the world, stadiums turned their lights blue in his honor. The loss of Maradona was felt like the loss of a family member, because he was more than a player. He was a symbol of passion, genius, and humanity's flaws. We already remember the terror of Euro 2020 when Christian Eriksen collapsed. But 2 years later, football gave us one of the most emotional comebacks ever. Against all odds, Eriksen returned to the pitch, playing again for Denmark and later joining Manchester United. Every time he touched the ball in his first game back, fans stood up to applaud. It wasn't just about football anymore, it was about life, resilience, and courage. Seeing Eriksen play again reminded us all why football is called the beautiful game, because it can give us hope even after the darkest nights. For over 26 years, Sir Alex Ferguson ruled Manchester United, building a dynasty of trophies, comebacks, and unforgettable nights. But on May 19, 2013, after his final game at Old Trafford, he stood on the pitch to say goodbye. With tears in his eyes and a trembling voice, Ferguson told the fans, "You have been the most fantastic experience of my life." Players, fans, and even rivals were overcome with emotion. It wasn't just the end of a career. It was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in football history. For millions, that speech remains one of the most emotional farewells the sport has ever seen. In 1998, David Beckham was vilified across England after being sent off against Argentina in the World Cup. Newspapers called him a traitor, fans burned effigies of him, and the pressure was unbearable. But 4 years later, in the 2002 World Cup, fate gave him a second chance, against Argentina again. When Beckham stepped up to take a penalty, the weight of a nation was on his shoulders. He scored, kissed the badge, and collapsed in relief. England fans, once his harshest critics, erupted in celebration. That single moment turned hate into forgiveness, despair into redemption. It showed the world that football always offers a second chance. For Italy, Euro 2020 wasn't just about football, it was about healing. The nation had suffered deeply during the COVID-19 pandemic, with thousands of lives lost and communities shattered. When Italy made their run to the final, the whole country united behind the team. Against England at Wembley, after a tense penalty shootout, Gianluigi Donnarumma made the decisive save. Italy were champions. Players fell to the ground crying. Fans at home spilled into the streets, hugging, singing and waving flags. It wasn't just about winning a trophy. It was about finding joy after pain, hope after despair. Italy's victory became a symbol of resilience for an entire nation. Nobody believed it was possible. Greece entered Euro 2004 as complete underdogs, ranked far below Europe's giants. But step by step, they shocked the world. They beat France, they beat the Czech Republic, and in the final, they faced the hosts, Portugal, led by a young Cristiano Ronaldo. In front of a stunned Lisbon crowd, Greece scored the only goal of the match and held on for a historic 1-0 victory. When the final whistle blew, Greek players collapsed in tears, unable to believe what they had achieved. The streets of Athens exploded with joy, millions celebrating what many still call the greatest underdog story in football history. For Greece, it was more than a trophy. It was a miracle, a once-in-a-lifetime moment that united the nation. The 2015-16 season began with Leicester City as relegation candidates. By the end, they were Premier League champions, At 5,000 to 1 odds, their triumph was the most unlikely in English football history. Led by Claudio Ranieri, powered by Jamie Vardy's goals, and lifted by a team of fighters, Leicester shocked the world. Fans cried in the stands, unable to process what they were witnessing. The moment became even more emotional when Andrea Bocelli sang to the crowd at the King Power Stadium as Ranieri stood beside him in tears. Leicester's triumph wasn't just a football story, it was a story of hope, proof that dreams really can come true. On April 15, 1989, tragedy struck at Hillsborough Stadium during an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. Due to overcrowding, 97 Liverpool fans lost their lives in a horrific disaster. The grief was overwhelming. Families, players and supporters carried the pain for decades. But out of that tragedy came unity. Rival fans held up scarves in tribute. Anfield was filled with flowers, and the words, "You'll never walk alone," echoed louder than ever. The fight for justice continued for years, and the memory of those lost lives remains sacred. The Hillsborough. Tributes are among the most emotional moments in football history, reminding us that the game is nothing without its fans. Few stories in football are as emotional as Ronaldo Nazario's redemption in 2002. 4 years earlier, at the 1998 World Cup final, he had suffered a mysterious illness hours before the match and played poorly in Brazil's shocking defeat to France. Many thought his career was finished after severe knee injuries. But in 2002 in Japan and Korea, Ronaldo returned stronger than ever. He scored 8 goals, including 2 in the final against Germany, leading Brazil to their 5th World Cup. When he lifted the trophy, tears flowed not just in Brazil, but around the world. It was the story of a fallen star rising again, of pain turning into glory, and of resilience inspiring millions. For over 20 years, Lionel Messi had been the heart of Barcelona. He wasn't just a player, he was the club's soul. But in August 2021, financial troubles forced Barcelona to part ways with their greatest icon. At his farewell press conference, Messi walked in, already crying, unable to hold back tears. He said goodbye to the club that had raised him, the fans who adored him, and the stadium that had been his home. Millions of fans across the world cried with him. It wasn't just the end of an era for Barcelona, it was the end of a love story between a player and a club that defined modern football. Kyiv, 2018. The world was watching as Liverpool faced Real Madrid in the Champions League final. But, just 30 minutes into the game, Mohamed Salah, Liverpool's talisman, collided with Sergio Ramos and landed awkwardly on his shoulder. Salah, crying uncontrollably, was forced off the pitch. For Liverpool fans, it was devastating, their hopes of victory shattered. But beyond the game, it was the image of Salah's tears that broke hearts across the globe. Just weeks away from leading Egypt at the World Cup, the dream of a nation seemed to vanish with him. Though he eventually recovered, that night remains one of football's most emotional examples of how cruel the sport can be. Sometimes, football's impact goes far beyond the pitch. In 2005, after Ivory Coast qualified for the World Cup, Captain Didier Drogba used the moment to plead for peace. Kneeling in the dressing room after the match, Drogba begged the warring factions of his country to lay down their arms. His message was broadcast across Ivory Coast, and incredibly, a ceasefire was declared. Football had achieved what politics could not. For Ivorians, that moment wasn't just about qualification, it was about hope, unity, and the power of the game to change lives. Drogba became not just a hero, but a peacemaker. For 25 years, Francesco Totti wore the colours of AS Roma. He was more than a player. He was Rome itself, the king of the Eternal City. But in May 2017, it was time to say goodbye. After his final match at the Stadio Olimpico, Totti walked around the stadium in tears, waving to the fans who had loved him his entire career. The stadium was filled with banners, chants, and sobs. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice cracked as he thanked the supporters for a lifetime of love. It wasn't just a farewell to a legend, it was a farewell to loyalty, to a career spent entirely with one club. The moment remains one of football's most emotional goodbyes. In December 2022, football lost its king. Pelé, the man who had defined the game for generations, passed away at the age of 82. Tributes poured in from every corner of the world. In Brazil, millions gathered to pay respects, while Santos carried his coffin through the streets of the city he made famous. FIFA, clubs and fans across continents honored him with ceremonies and messages. Pelé wasn't just remembered as the only man to win 3 World Cups, but as the global face of football's beauty. His passing united the June 15th, 2018. Portugal versus Spain in one of the greatest World Cup matches ever played. Cristiano Ronaldo, carrying the hopes of his nation, scored twice, but Spain led 3-2 late in the game. Then, in the 88th minute, Ronaldo stood over a free kick. With the entire world watching, he curled it into the top corner to complete his hat-trick. As he celebrated, arms wide, face full of emotion, the moment captured everything about his career: passion, pressure, and glory. For Portugal fans, it felt like a victory, even though the match ended in a draw. For the world, it was a reminder of Ronaldo's greatness and the raw emotion football brings. The Rose Bowl, Pasadena, Italy versus Brazil. After a grueling 120 minutes, the World Cup final came down to penalties. Roberto Baggio, Italy's superstar, stepped up needing to score. But under the weight of the world, his shot sailed over the bar. Brazil were champions, and Baggio stood frozen, head down, devastated. That image of him standing alone on the penalty spot became one of the most iconic and heartbreaking in football history. For Italians, it was pain. For neutrals, it was sympathy. For Baggio, it was a burden he carried for the rest of his career. Few misses in sport have ever been so emotional. AC Milan versus Liverpool, Champions League final 2005. By halftime, Milan were 3-0 up. Liverpool fans were crying, stunned, into silence. But then, something miraculous happened.